It was supposed to be a simple camping trip far out in the forest, away from the city. My friend Mark and I wanted to escape the stress of everyday life and spend a few days in nature. We had set up our tent, the campfire burned calmly, and the clear night sky above us seemed to soothe us. It was one of those nights where you felt truly free. The forest was silent, almost too silent. We talked softly, laughed, and watched the stars. Everything seemed so peaceful, so normal. The coolness of the night slowly crept into the air, but the fire kept us warm. We had no idea that this night would change everything. Around midnight, we decided to lie down. The tent was cozy, and the sounds of the forest lulled us into a light sleep. Yet I couldn't quite rest. Something kept me awake, a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't explain. It was as if someone or something was watching us. I pushed the thought aside and tried to fall back asleep, but the forest was no longer the same. It was as if the night had taken on an invisible presence, something alien lurking in the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a bright light penetrating the tent walls. At first, I thought it was moonlight or perhaps a vehicle moving nearby, but that couldn't be right. We were in the middle of nowhere, far from roads or civilization. I slowly sat up, my heart beating faster. "Mark, do you see that too?" I asked softly. He mumbled something as he slowly woke up. The light was now more intense, and it seemed to move above us like a hovering presence. It wasn't a normal headlight, not an airplane. It was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. My breathing quickened, and I knew something was wrong. We cautiously crawled out of the tent, and there we saw it, a huge, luminous object hovering high in the sky. Directly above us, it moved completely silently, and the light it emitted was so strong that it bathed the entire forest in an eerie white glow. I felt my stomach clench. It wasn't of this world, I knew that at that moment. Mark stared at the sky with the same disbelief as I did. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, but I couldn't give him an answer. My whole body was trembling, and I suddenly felt tiny and helpless. As the light continued to hover above us, I noticed that there were no more sounds. The forest, normally filled with insects and the rustling of leaves, was suddenly dead silent. It was as if the world had been drawn into a kind of vacuum, swallowing every sound. The silence was deafening and ominous. Mark and I just stood there, unable to move. Every fiber of my body told me to run, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if I was nailed to the spot. The light moved slowly over the trees, as if searching for something. My heart was pounding so loudly that I feared it would betray me. Time seemed to stretch, and the silence was almost unbearable. Then, quite suddenly, I felt the air around us grow colder, as if the light was draining all warmth from the surroundings. My breath became small clouds in the cold night air, and I felt panic rising within me. Mark said nothing, but I knew he was just as terrified as I was. Then the humming began. The hum was deep, almost imperceptible, yet it penetrated my head as if echoing directly in my brain. It was a sound that seemed not of this world, eerie and alien, and it seemed to emanate directly from the hovering light. The hum vibrated through my body, and I felt my hair stand on end. Mark grabbed my arm, his hand trembling. "What is that?" he whispered, panicked, but I couldn't answer. The humming grew louder, more intense, and I felt a pressure on my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind. My body reacted instinctively. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Then something inexplicable happened. My legs, my arms, everything suddenly felt heavy and immobile. It was as if an invisible force was holding me to the ground. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was completely paralyzed. Beside me, I could see that Mark was experiencing the same thing. His eyes were wide with the same fear. The humming grew even louder until it was unbearable. It felt as if my head would explode at any moment. I could do nothing. My body was completely out of control, as if an alien force had taken over me. I could only stare at the light above us, which was now so bright that it almost completely blinded my vision. Everything in me screamed for escape, but my muscles were frozen, trapped in a whirlpool of panic and helplessness. The humming continued to echo in my head, and I had the feeling that it wasn't just a sound, but something much deeper, as if it was touching my mind, controlling my will. I wanted to scream, to call Mark, but no sound escaped my lips. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Then I saw them, shadowy figures silently detaching themselves from the bright light and approaching us. They were slender, almost incorporeal. Their movements fluid and alien. I couldn't see their faces, only the shadowy outlines of their bodies gathering around us. The light flickered, and my heart pounded with fear. Mark stood beside me, but he was just as paralyzed as I was. The figures came closer, and I knew we were in great danger, but I could do nothing. The paralysis held me firmly in its grip, and the humming in my head grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. The figures came closer and closer, and although I couldn't see them clearly, I knew they were not human. Their movements were too fluid, too alien. They almost floated above the ground, and the bright light behind them bathed everything in an unreal atmosphere. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body was still paralyzed, unable to take even a single step. The fear that filled me was indescribable. I could feel the cold of the night settling around me, but it was as if my body no longer felt it. All that mattered was this humming, penetrating deeper and deeper into my head. The figures around us moved slowly, almost hypnotically. They seemed to communicate with each other without a sound being heard. One of them stepped directly in front of me. Although I couldn't see any eyes, I felt it staring at me, penetrating me. It was a feeling as if something alien was entering my mind, as if it was scrutinizing me. Every memory, every thought, every fear. I wanted to fight, scream, run, but nothing helped. I was completely at their mercy. Beside me, I saw that Mark was also trapped, his gaze empty, as if he was caught in a trance. The figures circled us, and I had the feeling that this was not just a meeting. They were here because of us. The longer the figures lingered around us, the more I felt that something within me was changing. It was as if my thoughts were no longer just my own. They seemed to penetrate deeper into me, exposing layers of my psyche that I didn't even know myself. A feeling of strangeness overcame me, as if I was no longer myself. It was hard to describe, but it felt as if they were searching for something within me, something I couldn't even grasp myself. My mind was like an open book, and I could do nothing about it. I knew that they were not just interested in my physical presence, they wanted more. My thoughts blurred, and I lost all sense of time. Minutes, perhaps hours, passed, but I couldn't say exactly. Then suddenly I felt a sting in my chest, as if something was passing through me. It was a strange feeling, as if they were touching my body with mere thoughts, manipulating me. I couldn't see, but I felt their presence within me, as if they were trying to understand or change my essence. My head ached from the effort, and the humming grew louder again. I desperately wanted to break free from this paralysis, but it was in vain. These beings had control over us, and I didn't know how we would escape. When the figures finally slowly retreated, the paralysis in my body lessened. I could move again, albeit clumsily. My head ached, and my whole body felt heavy, as if I had awakened from a long, deep sleep. Mark stood beside me. He looked just as exhausted and confused as I did. But the strangest part was not over yet. As I looked at my arms, I noticed strange patterns on my skin, fine circular lines, as if they had been burned into my skin. They glowed faintly in the moonlight, and I couldn't understand what they meant. "Mark, look at this," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. He looked at his own arms and discovered similar marks. "What the hell?" he mumbled, visibly shocked. The patterns on our skin were eerie and didn't look like they were caused by anything natural. They were precise, almost symmetrical, as if someone or something had placed them there intentionally. The cold crept up my back again. These marks, whatever they meant, were not of this world. I knew that what we had experienced was real, but these marks were proof that it hadn't just been a dream or a hallucination. Something had touched us, changed us. Just as we were trying to understand the strange marks on our skin, a piercing scream broke the silence of the night. It was a sharp, desperate sound that seemed to come directly from the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt panic seize me again. Who or what could that have been? Mark and I stared at each other for a moment before instinctively turning in the direction of the scream. It was as if the scream was calling us, forcing us to follow it. Yet every step in the direction it came from felt wrong. It was as if the forest wanted to hold us back, as if it wanted to warn us not to go further. Despite the fear that paralyzed us, we moved. The scream repeated, this time even louder and more desperate. It was impossible to say if it was human or something else, but one thing was clear. Someone or something was out there in distress, and we had to find out what it was. Every step through the dark forest made us shudder. The strange lights were gone, and it was as if nature had regained control, yet the memory of what we had just experienced hung over us like a heavy shadow. We had to find out what was really going on here. When we reached the place from which the scream had come, there was nothing. No sign of life, no trace of anyone or anything that could have caused the scream. It was as if the scream had simply vanished into thin air. The darkness around us was oppressive, and the silence had returned, but something was wrong. Mark glanced at his watch and suddenly realized something. "It's almost 4 a.m., he said, horrified. "That can't be." I looked at my watch too and felt as if the ground was giving way beneath my feet. We had lost hours without realizing it. The last memory I had was the light above us, then the humming, and now it was as if time itself had come undone. It was impossible to explain this gap. We couldn't remember what had happened in those hours, only these strange marks on our skin that reminded us of the inexplicable. The fact that we had lost so much time without being aware of it made my blood run cold. I felt my thoughts spinning in circles. What had these beings done to us, and what was the scream that had led us here? Every answer I sought seemed to raise more questions. The longer we stood in the dark, the more I realized that we had experienced something terrible. These beings had touched us, changed us, but not in a way we could understand. The truth that we had had no control over our own bodies and minds was unbearable. Something had used us, and we had no way to fight back. Mark was just as disturbed as I was. "That wasn't a dream, was it?" he asked softly, but I couldn't give him an answer. It felt too real, too vivid to be a dream. Yet the gaps in our memories were like a dark hole that had swallowed us. I knew that we would never truly understand what had happened. The night around us seemed to grow colder and colder, and although the forest was silent again, I knew that nothing would ever be normal again. The world as we knew it had changed that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we would feel the consequences of this encounter for a long time. I turned to Mark, and we both knew that we could never talk about this night. No one would believe us, and even if they did, how could we explain what we ourselves didn't understand? As we finally decided to return to the tent, it was almost morning. The sky was beginning to lighten slightly, but the horror of the night still hung heavily over us. Just when we thought it was over, I noticed something strange in the sky. Where the light had previously hovered, a luminous symbol now appeared on the horizon for a moment and then vanished. It was only an instant, but I knew that this symbol was something meaningful, a sign that haunted us, a reminder of what had happened. Mark saw it too, and we exchanged a brief glance. Whatever these beings wanted from us, it wasn't over yet. It was late at night, and I sat alone in my small radio station, as I often did. The sky was clear, and the hum of radio signals was comforting. I had been an amateur radio operator for years, and the crackle and hum of various frequencies were familiar to me. But on this night, something happened that would turn my whole world upside down. Around midnight, my radio suddenly picked up a transmission that was completely inexplicable. It wasn't a known frequency, no regular signal. At first, I thought it was just random noise or interference, but the signal was too strong, too precise. My heart began to beat faster, and I carefully turned the dials to better capture the signal. There it was again, a low mechanical hum, accompanied by a kind of voice that I didn't immediately understand. It wasn't human speech, rather a distorted, metallic whisper deeply embedded in the sounds. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it was nothing I had ever heard before. Something inside me told me that this was the beginning of something terrible. I tried to amplify the signal, and my radio began to receive strange patterns. The frequency I heard was not like the usual signals I knew. It seemed to come from nowhere, and the more I focused on it, the more unsettling it became. It was as if the signal was meant directly for me. The humming and whispering grew louder, and I felt my heart rate accelerate. My body reacted instinctively to the threat in the air. It wasn't just a technical phenomenon. It felt alive, as if the signal was observing me. I had the unsettling feeling that something or someone was at the other end of the signal, something that hadn't just contacted me but had found me. The frequency was so strange that I began to take notes, every number and sound I could hear, yet the patterns made no sense. And the longer I listened, the more my stomach churned. Something about this signal felt wrong, as if it came from far beyond our world. I knew I had to keep searching, but a part of me just wanted to turn off the radio and forget the whole thing. But something held me back, a strange curiosity that wouldn't let go. Whatever this signal was, I had to find out where it came from. Suddenly, the signal changed. The humming ceased, and instead I heard a clear, unmistakable voice. It wasn't the distorted, metallic voice from before, but a deep, calm voice speaking in perfect German. "We know you're listening," it said softly. My hands trembled, and I gripped the microphone tighter. Whoever this was, they knew I was here. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as if this voice was speaking directly to me, as if it could read my thoughts. "This is not interference," the voice continued. "We have found you." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt sweat run down my back. I was speechless. Who were they? What did they want from me? Every fiber of my body told me to stop, to turn off the radio and forget everything, but I couldn't. I was caught in the fascination and fear that this voice evoked in me. "We are coming," the voice finally said before the signal abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was almost more menacing than the voice itself. The last words, "we are coming," echoed in my head as I tried to grasp their meaning. I sat there, staring at the radio, which now only emitted static, and my body was paralyzed with fear. There was no answer, no further signal, only this silence that threatened to swallow me. Whatever this message meant, it was clear that it was meant for me. But how could they know me? I was nobody special, just an amateur radio operator who signaled in his free time. But now, after this message, I felt as if I had been drawn into something much bigger and more dangerous, something I couldn't control. I wanted to believe it was a prank, a strange coincidence, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The clarity of the voice, the precision of the signal, it was all too perfect to be a coincidence. Someone or something had intentionally contacted me, and the fact that they knew I was listening made my blood run cold. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound in my house made me jump, and the darkness around me felt alive. It was as if I was already being watched. The next day I felt dazed, as if I hadn't slept all night. The message from last night wouldn't leave me alone, and I had the feeling that things would only get stranger. In the evening, just as I was trying to calm down and regain some normalcy, there was a sudden knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I stared at the door. It was late. Far too late for visitors. I slowly went to the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the doorknob. Whoever was there couldn't have good intentions. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The street was empty and the darkness outside was impenetrable. I stepped out, looked around, but there was nothing to see, nothing to hear. Nevertheless, I felt a presence. It was as if someone was watching me but remained invisible. My stomach clenched, and fear crept into every fiber of my body. I knew it wasn't my imagination. The unwelcome visitor was real, even if I couldn't see them. I quickly closed the door and locked it, but the feeling that someone or something was near me wouldn't let go. Every sound in the house seemed louder, more menacing, and at that moment I knew I was no longer alone. After I locked the door, I felt safer for a moment, but that feeling didn't last long. My gaze wandered through the room, and suddenly my eyes fell on something that hadn't been there before. On the small table next to my radio was a strange device about the size of a palm. It looked as if it was made of a metal I had never seen before, smooth, without any screws or seams, and it emitted a faint bluish glow. I definitely hadn't put it there. My heart beat faster as I approached it hesitantly, unable to understand how this thing had gotten here. There were no traces, no sign that anyone had been in my house, yet this strange device now lay before me. It didn't look like something made by human hands. My fingers trembled as I tentatively reached for it. The moment I touched it, I felt a slight electric shock run through my body. The device's glow intensified, and it began to vibrate softly. I immediately let go, my heart pounding in my chest. This thing was alive in some way, but what was it for? And how had it gotten into my house? The feeling that I was being watched by something or someone became unbearable. This device was not of this world, and I knew it had a connection to the signal I had received. Just as I decided to pick up the device again, the light suddenly went out, and it lay motionless on the table again. For a moment, I thought it had simply turned off, but then when I looked closer, it was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, no sound. No flash, nothing. It had simply disappeared. I stood there, staring at the empty table, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My mind raced, but nothing I knew could explain this situation. Had I hallucinated all of this? Had I gone mad? But the shock I had felt earlier was real. The device had been real until it simply vanished. My pulse raced, and panic rose in me again. I couldn't understand how something so impossible could happen. It was as if reality itself was distorting before my eyes, as if I was being pulled into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The feeling that I was being watched was now almost overwhelming. I searched the whole house, looking for traces, for an explanation, but everything was as before. The only thing missing was this strange device. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. In the next few days, I tried to get my life back on track, but it was impossible to suppress the events. The signal, the voice, the vanished device, all of it wouldn't let me go. I had the feeling that something big, incomprehensible, had settled into my life, and I couldn't shake it off. One evening, as I was just trying to get back into a normal routine, my radio suddenly began to hum. My heartbeat accelerated, and I stared at the device. The hum was the same one I had heard the night I received the first signal. But this time it was even louder, more intense, as if it was calling me directly. Hesitantly, I sat down, reached for the microphone, but before I could say anything, the voice spoke again. "You cannot escape us," it said calmly. "We are always there." The words cut deep into my mind. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. I felt a coldness pass through me. "You are connected," the voice continued. "We see you." My breath caught. Whoever this was. They knew everything about me. I no longer had control over my own life, and at that moment, I realized that there was nothing more I could do to escape this situation. They were in my world, and I was in theirs. After the voice fell silent, I went outside as if I needed to find something to prove the reality of this situation. The sky was clear, the night calm, but suddenly I saw something on the horizon. In the distance, a light was moving. At first, I thought it was an airplane, but it moved too fast and at unnatural angles. It darted across the sky, disappeared, and reappeared. My heart skipped a beat. They were there. Whatever had contacted me through the signal, it was here now. I felt panic spread within me, but I couldn't tear myself away from the sight. The light was eerie, silent, and absolutely precise in its movements. It seemed to know exactly where I was. Then suddenly, the light vanished and reappeared directly above me. It was so fast that I barely had time to react. My breath caught, and I ran back into the house, locked the door, and felt like a hunted animal. My mind told me that it didn't matter where I was, they had already found me. I sat in the darkness of my house, the feeling of being hunted like a burden on my chest. Every second I expected them to come back. The light dancing in the sky was just the beginning. I was now part of something I couldn't control. I tried to think clearly in the next few hours, but my thoughts were a mess. It was as if I had slipped into another reality, one where the boundaries between our world and another were blurred. Everything I had believed up to that point seemed to vanish into thin air. Suddenly, I fell. It wasn't a physical fall, but a feeling as if the world around me was collapsing. My perception distorted, and I felt myself falling into an endless darkness. My surroundings changed as the space around me began to flow. I couldn't say if I was awake or dreaming. The feeling of falling was overwhelming, and I felt my body being pulled in all directions. It was a kind of dissolution, as if my existence in this world was no longer firmly anchored. The light I had seen before reappeared in my vision, and I knew that I was being pulled into another dimension or another reality. When I opened my eyes, everything was silent, but I knew I was no longer the same. Something had changed. I was no longer part of the world as I knew it. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my house, but everything felt wrong. The walls, the furniture, everything looked familiar, but it seemed as if an invisible veil lay over reality. It was as if I was looking through a fog that distorted the familiar. My head throbbed, and my body felt alien, as if I wasn't entirely myself anymore. I stood up, wobbly, and tried to orient myself, but something was different. The air was heavy, and the silence around me was oppressive. Every step I took echoed strangely, as if the room had grown larger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a world that was no longer my own. Then I heard it again, the humming. This time it wasn't coming from my radio, but directly from the walls. It was everywhere around me, and it grew louder, more intense. My breath quickened, and I felt panic rise within me. Was I still in my house, or was this a kind of parallel world I had been pulled into? Nothing made sense anymore, and my thoughts raced. The reality I knew was distorted. I felt like a puppet caught in a game whose rules I didn't understand. The humming became so loud that it enveloped my entire mind, and I knew I couldn't escape it. At that moment, I realized that I would never return to normalcy. The truth I had suppressed until now stood clear before me. I was part of a larger plan, a game that went far beyond my understanding. These beings who had contacted me had shown me that the world as I knew it was only a small part of a much larger reality. The humming stopped, but the feeling of strangeness remained. I was still in my house, but I knew that I had never truly escaped. These beings had found me. They had changed me, and I could do nothing about it. The message I had received was clear. I was no longer alone. The days passed, but I could no longer live a normal life. Every night I waited for the signal to return, for the voice to contact me again, but it didn't come back. Instead, they left me with this distorted reality in which I was trapped, an eternal feeling of uncertainty. I tried to talk to others about it, but no one believed me. I was labeled crazy. And soon I stopped talking about it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. They were still watching me, waiting for the right moment to make contact again. The truth I couldn't grasp was that they had never truly left me. They were always there, in the shadows, in the frequencies I couldn't hear, and one day they would return. It was a warm summer night, and everything seemed quiet. I was sitting on my porch, reading a book and enjoying the silence. The evening was clear, and the sky was full of stars. It was one of those evenings where you felt completely relaxed, as if the world stood still for a moment. But then it happened. The power suddenly went out. It happened without warning. The lights in the house went out, and the street lights in the area went out simultaneously. It was as if the whole area was plunged into darkness. At first, I thought it was just a simple power outage, nothing unusual, but something felt different. The air seemed to thicken, and a strange tension hung in the atmosphere. I stood up and went into the house, looking for a flashlight. My cell phone had no reception, which was unusual. A strange discomfort spread through me, as if I was suddenly cut off, not just from the power, but from the whole world. It was as if an invisible wall had separated me from everything I knew. But that was just the beginning. In the absolute silence that followed the power outage, I began to feel something, a presence I couldn't explain. When I stepped back onto the porch, I immediately noticed something strange. Above the forest surrounding my house, a faint light hovered. It wasn't an ordinary light, like from an airplane or a star. It moved slowly, almost motionless in the sky. And although it wasn't particularly bright, it immediately drew my attention. My first thought was that it might be a helicopter or a drone, but it was too quiet, almost silent. I couldn't hear a rotor, no engine. The light remained still in the sky, and the longer I stared at it, the more unsettling it became. It was as if the light was watching me too. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The light seemed to move slowly, directly towards my house. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't ignore the discomfort rising within me. I was alone, cut off from the outside world, without electricity, without cell phone reception, and this light seemed to be looking for me. The darkness around me seemed to grow denser, and the stars in the sky faded in comparison to this eerie light. Instinctively, I stepped back into the house, closed the door behind me, hoping the light would simply disappear. But deep down, I knew that what I was seeing was not natural. I stood at the window and watched the light, which approached slowly but steadily. But then I noticed something else. Shadows seemed to move above the trees in the forest. At first, I thought it was just the movement of branches in the wind, but there was no wind. The shadows were too big, too fluid, and they moved in a way that didn't fit the natural movements of the forest. My breathing quickened, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. They seemed to be heading towards the house, as if coming out of the darkness itself. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and panic began to rise within me. They weren't just shadows, they looked like figures moving fluidly and silently through the night. I stepped back from the window, my body tense with fear. These shadows were not normal, they didn't belong in this world. I felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The air in the house suddenly became stuffy, and the darkness seemed to oppress me. The light above the house remained, but the shadows at the edge of the forest moved unstoppably closer. It was as if something dark and incomprehensible was coming towards me, and I knew I could do nothing to stop it. The longer I watched the shadows, the more the feeling grew within me that I was not alone. It was an oppressive feeling, as if eyes were resting on me, studying me without my being able to see them. Every movement I made seemed to intensify the presence. My heart raced, and the silence around me became unbearable. I walked through the house, constantly turning around as if I could feel someone behind me, but there was no one. Yet I felt observed. It was as if something had settled into the darkness of my thoughts, something that went deeper than mere fear. These shadows, or whatever they were, wanted more than just to be seen. They wanted me. My hands trembled as I tried to lock the windows. It was a useless gesture, I knew, but it at least gave me a sense of control, even if it was only a faint one. But the feeling that I was no longer alone wouldn't let me go. The shadows now seemed to be everywhere. They crept closer to the house, and the light above the forest grew more intense. Whatever it was coming for me, and I couldn't stop it. Suddenly, a scream broke the silence of the night. It was a scream so loud and desperate that it pierced me to the core. I couldn't say if it was human, but it was full of agony. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt fear take deep root within me. It was as if the darkness itself had screamed, as if it was forcing its presence upon me. I ran to the window, but there was nothing to see, only the shadows now creeping even closer to the house and the light growing stronger. The scream still echoed in my ears, and I wondered if it had even been real. But the feeling of panic was real. I knew that I wanted to flee, to leave the house, but I was paralyzed with fear. The scream had trapped me in my fear, and the darkness around me now seemed alive. Whatever was out there had heard me. It knew I was here, and it wouldn't stop until it reached me. The shadows crept closer, and I knew this was the moment that would change everything. The scream still echoed in my thoughts as I slowly moved towards the back door. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorknob and quietly opened the door. Outside, it was pitch black. Only the eerie light in the sky faintly illuminated the garden. I stepped out and felt the cool night air hit my face. Every breath felt heavy, as if the air itself was working against me. Then in the faint light, I saw them, the figures. They stood at the edge of my garden, little more than shadows, but clearly there. They were tall, slender, and didn't move. It was as if they were just waiting for me to take the first step. My legs suddenly felt heavy, refusing the command to run. The silence was oppressive, and my heart raced as I tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't know what to do. These figures, whatever they were, seemed to be watching me, studying me. I couldn't make out their faces, but their eyes were fixed on me. It was a feeling of absolute helplessness, and I knew I was in their control. I wanted to run away, to rush back into the house, but something held me back. It was as if an invisible force compelled me to stand still, to expose myself to their presence. Then suddenly, one of the figures moved towards me slowly, without haste, but with a clear intention. My body stiffened with fear. As the figure came closer, I could discern more of it, although it was still shrouded in darkness. It seemed to float, its movements silent and fluid, as if it were not bound by the rules of this world. My heart raced, and I felt my breath quicken. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. Panic choked my throat. The figure stopped directly in front of me, and although I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was staring at me. It was an indescribable feeling, as if this figure was looking directly into my soul, penetrating every one of my fears and thoughts. An eerie hum hung in the air, almost as if the figures were communicating with each other, yet no sound came from their mouths. The other figures remained still at the edge of the garden, watching me from the darkness. It was as if they were waiting for a sign, as if they knew this was an important moment. The air around me was heavy, and I felt my legs threaten to give way beneath me. The silence was oppressive, and the presence of these beings made my blood run cold. Despite my fear, I couldn't move. It was as if I was stuck in time, unable to act. These silent figures seemed to surround me, and the feeling that I could escape their control waned further and further. Then, without warning, everything changed. The darkness, the figures, the garden, it was as if they were suddenly far away. I couldn't form a clear thought anymore. Time began to blur, and I lost all sense of how long I had been standing there. It was as if reality itself was distorting, as if I was being pulled into a void where neither space nor time existed. I no longer knew how long I had been there. It could have been minutes or hours. Everything around me seemed to blur, as if the world was caught in an endless loop. The figures no longer moved. The light in the sky remained still, and I felt like a puppet in a game I didn't understand. My head was empty, my thoughts erased. The fear that had previously gripped me tightly was no longer there. Instead, there was a strange indifference, as if I had resigned myself to my fate. I was caught in a state between waking and dreaming, and nothing that happened felt real. Then, suddenly, time seemed to exist again. The figures were still there, but something had changed. It was as if I had awakened into a new reality, one that was not my own, and although everything around me stood still, I knew this was just the beginning. As I awoke from my trance, my gaze fell to the ground of the garden. Where the figures had stood, strange symbols were now burned into the earth. They were circular, with intricate lines and patterns that no human could have made. It was as if the earth itself had been touched by these beings, as if they had left their marks. I knelt down, carefully touched the symbols, and immediately a shiver ran through me. The earth was warm, almost hot, and it felt as if it pulsed under my touch. These symbols were not just traces. They had a meaning, a message I didn't understand. My mind desperately tried to find an explanation, but there was none. The symbols seemed almost alive, as if they moved slightly under my touch. It was frightening and fascinating at the same time, and although everything in me screamed to run away, I couldn't tear my eyes from the strange patterns. They captivated me, and I knew that these symbols were connected to the figures. But what did they want from me? Why had they left these marks? The longer I thought about it, the deeper I sank into a feeling of confusion and fear. These beings had left something in my world that didn't belong here, and I knew I wouldn't find the answers that night. The realization that I had been pulled into something I didn't understand became overwhelming. The fear that had previously paralyzed me turned into pure panic. I had to get away, out of the garden, away from these symbols, away from these figures that had captivated me. Without further thought, I jumped up and ran back into the house, my hands trembling as I slammed the door shut and locked all the locks. But I knew it made no difference. These beings were not of this world, and doors couldn't stop them. Nevertheless, I felt safer as I locked myself in my house. My heart pounded like crazy, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I ran through the house, closing every window, locking every door. As if that would help anything. My mind was a chaos, and I desperately tried to regain control, but deep down, I knew I couldn't escape this situation. These beings, these figures, they couldn't be stopped by normal means. When I finally arrived in my bedroom, I sat down on the bed, my body trembling with exertion and fear. The symbols, the figures, the light in the sky, all of it felt so surreal, but I knew it was real. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. As I sat there on my bed, still trembling, a bright beam of light suddenly shone through the window. It was the light from the sky, now directed straight at my house. My heart skipped a beat and panic seized me again. The beam of light was so intense that it illuminated the entire room as if it were midday. I knew this was no coincidence. They had found me. The beam of light moved slowly, as if scanning the room. It was as if it was searching for something, and the eerie feeling that it was aimed directly at me made my blood run cold. I wanted to hide, to run away, but where? There was no safe place. This light penetrated everything, and the figures outside had left their marks. There was no escape. The beam focused on me, and I felt my body suddenly become heavier. An invisible force held me firm, as before in the garden. I couldn't move, not even twitch. It was as if the light was trapping me, controlling me. My mind raced, but my body was paralyzed. The light grew more and more intense until it swallowed everything around me. The room, the bed, the walls, everything disappeared in this bright glow. I could no longer distinguish where I was. There was only the light and this unbearable power holding me captive. And then suddenly it was all over. The light disappeared and I was alone in my room. Darkness returned. And silence was back. I lay on the bed, my body felt heavy and drained, as if all energy had been sucked out of me. My head throbbed and my heartbeat was the only thing I could hear. I tried to sit up, but my whole body ached. It was as if something had happened to me, something I couldn't explain. The figures, the light, the symbols, all of that had disappeared, but the effects remained. I was no longer the same person. Something inside me had changed, as if they had taken a part of me. I looked out the window. The sky was dark again, the stars shone, and the forest was silent. But I knew that what had happened was real. The marks in the garden, the figures that had watched me, they were real. I wasn't crazy, but I knew I would never truly know what exactly had happened. The next few days passed in a haze. I didn't talk to anyone about it, who would have believed me anyway. But every time I went into the garden, I saw the marks on the ground. They didn't fade, and they reminded me that this night had truly happened. And deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. These figures had touched me, and whatever they had taken from me, it would haunt me forever. It all began with an unexpected invitation. My old friend Tobias, whom I hadn't seen in years, wrote me a message one day. He now lived in a secluded village somewhere deep in the mountains. "You must visit me," he wrote. "This village is different, you'll see." It was a strange invitation, but I was curious. Tobias had always had a penchant for the unusual. In our youth, he was obsessed with conspiracy theories and old stories about the unknown. I thought it was just another one of his strange ideas, yet something about his message wouldn't let me go. Perhaps it was the tone. He sounded urgent, almost desperate. After a few days of deliberation, I decided to visit him. I was on vacation and thought it might be a good opportunity to relive old times, so I packed my things and set off for this unknown village somewhere off the beaten path. The drive took hours. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The roads became narrower, the mountains higher, and soon I was surrounded by nothing but dense forest and steep cliffs. The feeling of remoteness grew stronger and stronger, but I didn't know that this was only the beginning. When I finally reached the village, it was already late afternoon. The sunlight was faint, and the long shadows of the mountains lay like a blanket over the narrow streets. The village consisted of old, dilapidated houses, and it looked deserted. No human soul was to be seen, no sounds, only absolute silence. I drove slowly through the narrow streets looking for Tobias's house. It was difficult to orient myself, as all the houses looked alike, old, built of wood, and most seemed to have been uninhabited for years. The village felt like a relic from another time, trapped in an eerie calm that made me nervous. Finally, I found his house at the edge of the village. It was no different from the others, dilapidated as if left to decay. I parked in front of the house, got out, and immediately felt the cold of the mountains. It was as if the village itself was telling me that I wasn't welcome here. Nevertheless, I went to the door and knocked, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. An uneasy feeling spread in my stomach. Where was Tobias? Had he forgotten me? I tried to use my cell phone to call him, but there was no reception, no signal, no connection to the outside world. I was truly alone. I decided to look for someone in the village who could help me. There had to be someone living here. But as I walked through the empty streets, I felt that something was wrong. The houses were all closed, the shutters drawn, and there were no signs of life whatsoever. It was as if the village had been abandoned for years. Suddenly, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. A door opened slightly, and I saw a figure behind the window of one of the houses. It was only a brief glimpse, but I was sure someone was there. I went closer, but before I could knock on the door, the figure vanished and the door closed again. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It seemed as if the villagers didn't want to talk to me. Every attempt to find someone failed. The silence of the village grew more and more oppressive, and the feeling of isolation increased. The streets were deserted. Yet I felt observed. Something about this place was deeply unsettling. As I went back to Tobias's house, I saw a movement in one of the windows again, but this time it wasn't just a fleeting apparition. A woman stood at the window, staring out directly in my direction. The woman standing at the window seemed strangely familiar and yet alien at the same time. Her face was pale, her eyes stared at me as if they could see right through me. She didn't move, said not a word, but only watched me. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, and my heart began to beat faster. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from her. It was as if she had cast a spell over me. The cold of the night crept up my spine, and a strange hum hung in the air. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, like a background noise that swallowed everything around me. Suddenly, she took a step back, vanished into the darkness of the house. I wanted to follow her, knock on the door, and find out who she was, but something held me back. The humming grew louder, and the feeling that something unnatural was going on in the village grew stronger and stronger. I turned around and went back to Tobias's house, but when I arrived, the door was wide open. The hum that had previously only been in the background was now louder, more intense. It seemed to come from inside Tobias's house. My heart pounded, and I didn't know if I should enter. Everything in me screamed to leave, but something pulled me into the house. Perhaps Tobias was there. Perhaps I could finally find out what was going on here. I cautiously stepped over the threshold, and immediately an oppressive darkness enveloped me. The humming seemed to come from the walls themselves, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. It felt as if I had stepped into another world, one that no longer followed the laws of reality. I called out for Tobias, but there was no answer. The house was silent, apart from this eerie sound vibrating in my ears. It was as if something or someone was waiting for me in the house. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I cautiously groped my way through the darkness, deeper and deeper into the house that felt more and more alien. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, in a small room, a faint light shone. As I approached the faint light at the end of the hallway, I felt the atmosphere around me change. The humming grew more intense, almost hypnotic, and the feeling of oppression increased. My heart raced, but I couldn't turn back. Something compelled me forward, as if I had no other choice. I reached the room where the light glowed. It was a small lamp on an old table, yet the light it emitted felt strange, not warm, but cold, almost unreal. The humming filled the room, and it was now as if it echoed directly in my head. I felt dizzy, as if I was being pulled into a dream from which there was no waking. Suddenly, I looked out the window. The stars that had previously shone in the sky were gone. The sky was pitch black, as if an invisible force had extinguished the stars. My stomach clenched. It was as if the entire village had been shifted into another dimension, one that was no longer connected to our world. I took a step back, but the feeling of threat wouldn't let me go. Something incomprehensible had happened in this village, and I knew there was no easy way out. I slowly turned around and looked into the darkness of the hallway. The house seemed to enclose me as if it were alive. Every step I took echoed eerily through the walls, and the humming gave me no second of peace. It was as if the house itself wanted to tell me that I shouldn't be here. I knew I couldn't ignore this light any longer. Whatever was going on here, it was centered on this room. But before I could investigate the room further, I noticed that something was wrong with the house. It felt too empty, as if it wasn't just abandoned, but as if it had never truly been inhabited. There were no personal belongings, nothing to suggest that Tobias had lived here. My mind spun in circles. Where was Tobias? Had he lured me here, or had he also been drawn into this darkness? I called his name again, but there was no answer. It was as if my voice was swallowed by the air, and the feeling of isolation grew with every breath. I had to get out of this house, but the humming grew louder and louder. Something was holding me here, and I knew I had to find out the truth about what was happening here. Just as I decided to leave the house, I heard a faint sound. It came from the other side of the hallway, a creak as if a door that had been locked for a long time was opening. My heartbeat accelerated, and I cautiously walked in the direction of the sound. At the end of the hallway was a door that had previously been locked, but was now slightly ajar. I approached the door and felt a cold emanating from the room that had nothing to do with the night's temperature. It was a deep, eerie cold that made me feel that something was not of this world. The humming was now almost deafening, and it clearly came from this room. With trembling hands, I pushed the door further open and looked inside. The room was almost empty, apart from an old chest in the middle. It was dusty, and it looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. But the humming grew more intense the closer I got to the chest. It was as if something trapped inside it wanted to get out. I knelt down, unsure whether to open the chest, but something inside me said that this was the key to everything that was happening here. The answer lay in this chest. Just as I placed my hand on the lid of the chest, I heard them, voices, softly whispering, as if several people were speaking at once, yet I couldn't understand any words. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if they echoed directly in my head. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I hastily withdrew my hand. The voices were alien, not human. It was as if they came from another reality, as if something incomprehensible was trying to communicate with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the chest was the origin of these voices, but whatever was inside, it felt wrong, dangerous. My mind was torn between the curiosity to open the chest and the fear of what I would find inside. The humming and the voices grew louder, more insistent. It was as if they were calling me, forcing me to continue, yet I hesitated. Suddenly, the voices ceased, and the silence that followed was almost more menacing. I knew I had to make a decision. Would I find out what was behind all of this, or would I leave this place before it was too late? Before I could open the chest, a bright light illuminated the room. It was the same light I had seen before above the village, but now it was much more intense. It seemed to penetrate the walls as if searching for me, fixating on me. My heart raced, and the humming in my ears became unbearable. I knew I didn't have much time. I ran out of the room and rushed through the hallway. Outside, the light was now so bright that it illuminated the entire sky. It was not like the light of stars or the moon. It was unnatural, alien, as if it came from another world. The entire sky above the village was filled with this light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was directly connected to the voices and the humming. The villagers, whom I hadn't seen before, were suddenly everywhere. They stood silently in the streets, staring motionlessly at the sky as if worshipping the light. Their faces were empty, and their eyes gleamed in the bright glow. It was as if they were caught in a trance, unable to react. I wanted to run away, but the light was everywhere. It filled the air, and I felt it drawing me into its spell. There was no escape anymore. I knew I could no longer stay in the streets of the village. The light above us was menacing, and the villagers stood like empty shells that seemed to perceive nothing of this world anymore. My instinct told me I had to get away, out into the fields surrounding the village. Perhaps I could find an escape route there. With trembling steps, I ran through the narrow alleys until I reached the fields. The night was cold, and the unnatural light illuminated the landscape in a pale, ghostly glow. My breath was heavy, and I could still hear the humming, which now grew quieter the further I moved away from the village. But my relief did not last long. Suddenly, I saw a figure on the horizon. It stood motionless in the middle of the field, its head tilted upwards as if contemplating the light in the sky. At first, I thought it was another villager, but as I came closer, I realized that this was something else. The figure was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a human. My heart raced. The figure slowly turned around, and I saw that its eyes reflected the same unnatural light coming from the sky. It seemed to see me, although it didn't move. I stood frozen. It was as if it was penetrating my mind, as if it could see right through me. My knees trembled, and I knew I was in danger. Then, without warning, it began to move towards me, slowly but unstoppably, as if it knew I had no chance to escape. At that moment, I realized that I would never truly escape. this figure in the field. The light that had engulfed the villagers and me, all of it, was part of a larger plan that I couldn't comprehend. Whatever was happening here in the village, it was no longer in my control. I turned and ran as fast as I could, away from the figure, away from the village, but I knew there was no real escape. The light above me grew more and more intense, as if it was embracing me, as if it was calling me. Every step became harder for me, and the feeling of heaviness in my limbs increased. I felt as if I was walking through water, as if the air itself wanted to stop me. My breath came in gasps, and my mind was a chaotic mess of panic and confusion. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I felt my legs give way. I fell to my knees, the cold ground of the field beneath me. The light above me encompassed everything, and the figure came closer until I felt its cold gaze pierce me. It was a moment of total helplessness, and I knew I couldn't escape. The night swallowed me. The humming and the light merged into one last piercing sound, and then there was only darkness.